Hello, and welcome to the History and Geography of Natural Psychoactive Substances. Today's lecture is on khat, a plant that grows in the Horn of Africa area and in Yemen. It has a very potent stimulant and is associated with a number of social problems in that part of the world. The discussion of khat is relatively brief, and this lecture will move on then to consider some somewhat similar or related drugs. Captagon, which is an artificial drug created in the lab, but also found in the same part of the world, and it's been occasionally analogized with khat. The closest natural drug to Captagon is ephedra, which is a very common desert plant, and it's been used medicinally by a number of different societies. And then we'll end with a discussion of soma, which is a very important drug from ancient history, but we don't know what it actually was. The main contender for soma today is ephedra. So we'll talk about all of these issues in today's lecture. So khat, the leaves of a plant, a scientific name of which is Khat edulis, has alternative spellings. It is grown most widely in the highlands of Yemen, although it's also found across the Red Sea in Somalia, Ethiopia, and other countries, and is cultivated very extensively in Yemen. You can see in the photo it dominates this agricultural scene. The map of khat use around the year 1500 is very similar to that of coffee. They were domesticated in very roughly the same area, probably in the southern or eastern highlands of Ethiopia, and by this time it spread across the Red Sea. Coffee was to go on to spread explosively around the world in the next few centuries. Khat slowly expanded out of its homeland, although it seems to be expanding fairly rapidly today. There's long been debate about its major psychoactive component. It was long thought to be caffeine, but recent research has suggested it's a different alkaloid found in the plant, cathinone. Cathinone stimulates the release of dopamine and inhibits the uptake of epinephrine and serotonin. That gives it sort of a double whammy, if you will. It's quite potent, much more so it seems to be, and I should say I've had no experience with this substance, but from what I've read, it has a much more significant high or euphoric effects than do other plant-based stimulants. More similar to cocaine, in other words, than coca. If you chew coca leaves, you do get cocaine in your bloodstream, but the effects are fairly mild. More similar to coffee, strong coffee perhaps, than khat. So to quote the Wikipedia, khat chewing and the effects of cathinone on the body differ from person to person, and I should say that's always true. But there is a general pattern of behavior that emerges. First, feelings of euphoria that last a couple hours, discussion of serious issues, discussion of issues at least, active imagination, then followed by depression, irritability, loss of appetite, and insomnia. So to the extent that this is indeed the case, this is much more similar to methamphetamine or cocaine than it would be to the plant-based stimulants that we've discussed so far. A number of sources have described khat as a curse, particularly in Yemen, Somalia, parts of Ethiopia, where it is habitually consumed. So again, we see the same sort of descriptions here. Initially, euphoria, excitement, energy, alertness, ability to concentrate, improvement in self-esteem. That's something that's very much associated with cocaine. And methamphetamine, it's certainly not associated with coffee or tea or nicotine. Oh, and an increase in libido, which is interesting. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but that's distinctive from some other stimulants. Unpleasant effects, yes, insomnia, numbness, lack of concentration, and low mood. So khat is chewed. It must be fairly fresh for it to be active. So these are simply leaves stuffed into the mouth. It's a quite active chewing process is necessary. It's interesting, this sort of a guide on how to chew khat, but it almost always takes place in groups. It's a very social drug in Yemen, Somalia, and places where it's normally consumed. And yes, initially an atmosphere of cheerfulness. People become happy, eager to talk more, become very active, feel that they could do a lot. And interesting here, it notes that some people could read a lot, like several hundred pages of a book. Again, we could say the same thing about cocaine or meth. The long-term effects are worrisome. I'll just quote the Wikipedia here. The chewer can develop constipation and heartburn after one khat session, and long-term effects can include gum disease, oral cancer, cardiovascular disease, and depression. The withdrawal symptoms of cathinone include hot flashes, lethargy, and a great urge to use the drug for at least the first 2 days. So 2 days is really not very much. I wish more research had been done on this. It's really pretty sparse. Some of the harm assessments I've seen seem, in light of what I have just discussed, to be quite misleading. So here's a few that easily found on the internet, which try to assess harm to the self, harm to others, physical dependence. Both of these put khat in a very low position. Relatively little harm, relatively little addiction. It may be out of date, it may be inaccurate, it may be from lack of research, or it may be correct. I mean, it's really hard to say. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration certainly thinks khat is a dangerous substance. Now, of course, the DEA tends to go overboard on some of these issues, so I'd take this with a grain of salt, but it's still worth considering. Can induce manic behavior, grandiose delusions, paranoia, nightmares, even it says here hallucinations. I haven't read that anywhere else. Can result in violence, suicidal depression. I think this is a bit, it can perhaps. I don't think these are common effects, but I do think they're cause for concern. Another issue is environmental. Khat has really the use of khat has intensified, especially in Yemen, over the last few decades. And khat growing has taken over much of the main agricultural land of the country. Most of the agriculture in Yemen is in the Western Highlands, the only part of the country really that gets adequate rainfall for agriculture. Well, there's a few areas that can get water from wells in wadis or seasonal streams. But you can see heavily terraced and tremendous amount of agricultural land is now devoted to khat. Supposedly it takes up 40% of Yemen's water, and it's in short supply. You can see on the rainfall map that Yemen is an arid country. Most of the country gets less than 10 inches of rain. Many areas get less than 5 inches. And only in the Western Highlands, you can see the highlands on the topography map on the right, is there sort of somewhat adequate rainfall, only up to 20 inches. Some of the peaks get higher than that. It's concentrated in the summertime and used extensively for khat cultivation. Now, Yemen also has low levels of socioeconomic development, the lowest in the Middle East. This is a map of the Human Development Index. That's a composite index that takes into account economic development and social development issues like health, longevity, education, and so on. So you can see on this map, Israel is in the highest status here for the Middle East, but relatively high human development in Saudi Arabia, the wealthy oil exporting countries like United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar. Much lower in other countries, with Syria and Yemen being at the bottom. Syria has been war-torn since 2011, and Yemen has been as well. So they're both noted for conflict, but you could see there in the highland part of Yemen, particularly the lowest, by a significant margin, the lowest human development in the region. And some scholars say that khat is partly to blame for this. It's estimated that 80% of Yemeni men chew khat and usually do so every afternoon. Essentially, much of the, especially in the highlands, I should say, but in this region, uh, many businesses simply shut down in the afternoon. May open up again later on, but they'll be shut down for many hours as men gather together in these very social and convivial khat chewing sessions. But the sociability and the conviviality only lasts so long. Many children in Yemen chew khat as well. Here's from a YouTube a video on Khat, Yemen's addictive narcotic chewing leaf, with the interviewer talking to children, claiming, and they're actively chewing in this photo, they chew every day. So worrisome again. It's always more troublesome to have children using psychoactive substances. And it has been suggested by many authors that khat consumption is associated with political instability as well. So here's an article from a journal called Paste, How an Obscure Drug Cultivation Led to Civil War in Yemen. And it's not a new thing. Yemen and Somalia have in the past attempted to outlaw khat, and it led in both cases to civil unrest and intensified civil war in Somalia. Although Somalia really essentially collapsed in 1991, but it's had a lot of tension even before that. And neither of these countries have an effective central government today. Here's a map showing the political situation in Yemen. It's from a couple of years ago, but things haven't changed all that much. The green area is controlled by the Houthi rebels. They're in the news a lot today for their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. This is a Shia militant group that has taken over the most densely populated part of the country, including its capital. This is the Western Highland Zone and on down to the coast. But they're contending with a southern transitional council, which is backed by the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia is backing another group. There are there are hardcore Sunni Islamist groups in other areas of the country. So since the Arab Spring in 2011, Yemen has not had a central government to speak of. It's war-torn, and there's been a lot of speculation that Khat is at least partly responsible for this, although it's very difficult to figure out to what extent that would be true. Somalia also has no effective central government. This map shows a large area in blue that says Somali government, but no Somali government and allies. So there are a lot of militia groups, armed groups that pledge allegiance to the very ineffective Saudi government, which rules relatively little of the country. There are Islamist rebels. There are others. There's a self-declared Republic of Somaliland in yellow in the far north, which actually does have an effective government. Historically, the first record of khat consumption comes from a polity known as the Sultanate of Ifat. By sultanate, it's a Muslim state in the 14th century. At this time, Ethiopia was divided into what had been a relatively strong Christian, Orthodox Christian, actually to be more precise, Oriental Orthodox Christian. This is the branch of Christianity one finds among the Copts in Egypt, among the main Armenian church. It's similar to Eastern Orthodoxy, but has some historical doctrinal differences. But Ethiopia is usually associated historically with this Orthodox Christian community, but it only ruled the northern highlands. Also, there was an area where Judaism was very widespread, and there was actually a pretty substantial Jewish population in Ethiopia until modern times, when most of the Ethiopian Jews went to Israel. And then note the Sunni Muslim state and area in the eastern part and southeastern part of the country. So that would have been the Sultanate of Ifat. Its capital was the highland city of Harar. It's a well-known city. It's one of the sort of few remaining walled medieval cities in the world, where the wall really marks the edge of the city. It's a UNESCO heritage site. It's noted as the fourth holiest city in Islam, and is called in Arabic the City of Saints. So this is the historical locus of Islam in Ethiopia. And Khat chewing spread here, or was adopted here, for essentially the same reason initially as coffee. It was a stimulant used by Sufi Muslim mystics to stay awake at night. They were and are noted for their often all night long sessions of chanting and dancing and doing other sort of practices to reach a mystical state. And stimulants were very helpful in this regard. So back to this map showing the area of Khat around or before 1500, pretty limited, but it had spread from Ethiopia across the Red Sea to the highlands of to the highlands of Yemen. Today it is spreading in Ethiopia, which is interesting. Historically, it was just limited to Muslim areas. But to quote this article, in recent years, Khat cultivation and consumption have spread to new populations in regions like Amhara, which is mostly Orthodox Christian, into the countryside where young people munch leaves without their parents' knowledge, speaking in code to avoid detection. So it used to be religiously coded, evidently not so much. Here's a map showing the current religious geography of Ethiopia. Green is Islam, and darker green just means a higher percentage of the population follows Islam. So it's an interesting map combining depiction of Orthodox Christianity, Protestant Islam, and then traditional religions, and then giving the plurality faith with a particular color, and then having darker colors where it's a higher level. So you can see in the north it's very, very heavily Ethiopian Orthodox Christian. There are a lot of Pentecostal Protestant Christians, although they're almost all Pentecostal. These were areas that were formerly animist or had tribal religions where Christian missionaries have been spreading. But I just note here in the map the spread into these predominantly Christian areas. And some sources, not very many, this is a rather, I think, exaggerated map, but it's claiming that Khat, originating in Ethiopia, spread through about half of the African continent, all the way to Angola, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, including Madagascar, and then in Ethiopia as well. So I was surprised and confused by this map. I looked for sources to verify or disconfirm. Couldn't find much. At the end, I turned to Chat GPT, and it has, is Khat consumed in Ethiopia? And it says yes. I ask if Khat is consumed in Madagascar, and it says no. Well, you can't trust Chat GPT. You can get some good information from it. So all I can really say is it is spreading. It spread to Afghanistan through radical Muslim networks. Is it being grown there? That's a very interesting question. If it's not, if its leaves are being brought in, that has to be done quite quickly. They lose potency, but you can do it with airplanes and fast delivery surfaces. So that may be the case. So Khat is difficult to smuggle, but and it's illegal in the U.S., only with a prescription in Canada, but yet it is actively smuggled into both countries. You have pretty substantial, especially Somali immigrant populations in both U.S. and Canada. And Khat has, like I say, spread to other countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, and it seems to be transferred to the U.S. and Canada from those countries as well. I looked for information on arrests. I did this in the spring. The only information I found was more than a decade old, but it was some 18 individuals with 4.4 million grams. Now, when you have such quantities, I don't think grams is the best unit of measurement. But no surprise, it was naturalized U.S. citizens from Somalia, and they sent packages to the U.S. via the Postal Service and delivery companies. Evidently, well, with air transport, that's fast enough. and allegedly transmitted proceeds from their drug sales to others in Britain, Kenya, Somalia, and Uganda. So very much a global international organization. I imagine it's still being smuggled in large quantities. The fact that I couldn't find other information on arrests perhaps indicates that these laws are not being pushed very hard. Now, what about Khat under Islamic law? Remember, Islamic law prohibits intoxication, at least that's usually interpreted. So I go to Islam QA and I simply inquire through an internet search, what is the consensus? And this site said, and I'll just quote what I have highlighted here: Khat is considered to be a drug and an intoxicant by experts in the field. According to the above information, it would not be permissible to consume Khat, as it would intoxicate the person. And then at the bottom, every intoxicant is forbidden. That's from a hadith is widely used in Islamic law. Well, this presents a problem. If Khat is haram, if it's forbidden under Islamic law, why is it so common in very devoutly Muslim countries like Somalia and Yemen? So again, I go to ChatGPT after not finding out information in other searches. And yes, there are arguments for it being haram or forbidden. There's also arguments for it being halal, which means acceptable, or discouraged but not forbidden. But the key here is the regional difference. In Yemen and East Africa, so Yemen, Ethiopia, Somalia, parts of Kenya, local Islamic authorities and scholars say it is allowable, whereas in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and indeed in most of the Muslim world, Muslim scholars say no, it is not. So yes, it depends. Now, I'm going to move on from Khat to Captagon, which is a completely different drug, but it is sometimes analogized. The reason why I initially put Captagon into this lecture as it was originally given as a course in the Stanford Continuing Studies program is one of the students in the class kept asking me about it and wondered if it was related to Khat and what the issue was. And I had only vaguely aware of it, but I got quite interested because it is an important and distressing issue. So anyway, it is basically a kind of amphetamine. It was marketed as a psychostimulant at one time in the United States. It is now illegal in most countries. And is produced for illicit use, and Syria is the largest producer, accounting for about 80%. In fact, some have suggested that Syria is something of a Captagon narco state. Here's a New York Times article on Syria's ruins. Syria has been devastated by more than a decade of civil war. But powerful associates of Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad, are making and selling Captagon, creating a new narco state. Production and distribution overseen by the 4th Armored Division of the Syrian Army, commanded by the president's younger brother. So this is, and also real close connections with the Lebanese Shia militant group Hezbollah, which is essentially in a state of war with Israel today. So this is an important issue in the Middle East. This map is a little bit out of date, but it just shows Captagon, where it has been seized from 2016 to 2021. And you can see it's by no means, just in Syria, a lot spreading as far as Italy, down to throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and quite commonly used. Most distressingly, it is closely associated with war. Here's a USA Today headline where the Hamas attacks on Israel last year so brutal because the killers were high on Captagon. And nicknames are things like the jihadi drug, Captain Courage, the poor man's cocaine. It was found on some Hamas members who were killed during the attacks in 2023 in Israel, and is alleged to often be used by ISIS fighters. So here from the same article. Those who go on jihad missions take a lot of it to prepare. It supposedly leads to zombie-like detachment, a thirst for fighting and killing. I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical when I read things like this, because in the past there have been a lot of lurid depictions of many drugs. We'll see this very clearly when we get to cannabis, but just grotesque exaggerations designed to promote fear and panic. So I wonder, is this a case of exaggeration? But this is a new drug, and different drugs have different effects. I don't think it's been studied enough. Certainly, related synthetic drugs like methamphetamine are associated with a lot of criminal activities and violence, and can be depicted in somewhat similar terms. And of course, it depends on the dose and how long it has been consumed. But anyway, back to the article. Captagon allows fighters to withstand pain such as being shot by bullets. Well, that's interesting and distressing if true. And it also talks about Israeli interrogators who would leave prisoners for about 2 days without questioning, so that Captagon would wear off, so that they could become more amenable to interrogation. Recent news, again, this was from last spring when I initially gave this class, but Iraq had seized 2.5 million Captagon pills. Now, in the natural world, the closest analog of Captagon is ephedrine. And this is a medicine. It's a stimulant. It's used to prevent low blood pressure during anesthesia, so it's actually very important medically. It has common side effects, trouble sleeping. Well, no surprise, it's a powerful stimulant. Anxiety, that's often associated with stimulants. Headache, hallucinations. Now, that is rare for stimulants, but it's dose dependent. If one takes enough cocaine or methamphetamine for a long enough period, one will not uncommonly experience hallucinations. So these are not hallucinogens, but if taken in adequate dose, they can cause hallucinations. And it also causes high blood pressure, fast heart rate, loss of appetite, and is a chemical precursor in the manufacture of methamphetamine in illicit manufacturing. So ephedrine is it's a problematic substance. On the other hand, it is historically, in its botanical form as a tea, has been a very important medicine and also sort of a mild stimulant. So it's known as mahuang in Chinese language. It's very important in traditional Chinese pharmacopoeia, used sometimes effectively for asthma, for allergies, for some other issues. In the United States, it's commonly referred to as Mormon tea or Brigham tea, after Brigham Young, Mormon leader. That's rather ironic. When the Mormons made their migration to Utah in the 1840s, they were taught about ephedra from the local American Indians, indigenous inhabitants, and started to drink it as a tea. Now, as I discussed before, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, the word of wisdom prohibits the consumption of hot drinks. But very early days, Mormons took this to mean coffee and tea, which contain caffeine, or are forbidden. So they thought hot chocolate or something like that is fine. And when they went to Utah, they thought, well, this plant is fine. It's a soothing tea. Yes, as you can see the sign from the official sign here, I believe that's from a national park. Yeah, it was a soothing beverage. Now, eventually they, when it was determined that yes, it does have a powerful stimulant, Mormons quit drinking it, so it is no longer consumed. But it still has that name, and it's a common desert plant found in both Asia and in North America. One of the things I find most interesting about ephedra, it is now the leading candidate for soma, also called hauma. Here's a Reddit post saying, if you're curious, the soma god ritual drink plant is ephedra. Now, what do we mean, soma god ritual drink plant? Well, this is the biggest sort of mystery in the history of mind-altering substances, is what was soma. So soma is the term soma is used repeatedly in the Rig Veda. This is the oldest work of Hindu scripture, if you will, composed in what is known as the Vedic Sanskrit text. It dates back to at least the second millennium BCE, so probably some 1,500 years or more before the Common Era began. It was passed on as memorized poetry before it was written down, but is one of the oldest texts in the world, and a text that has continued to be used, read, and forms one of the foundations of Hinduism, if you will. Now, it's known as Hauma. I hope I have the right pronunciation. I went online to get pronunciation guides, and they had different pronunciations for this, so a little bit confusing. But this is a sacred psychoactive substance of Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism is a religion that barely survives today. It only has a few tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of adherents, some in Iran where it originated, more in India, and a few in the United States and Europe. Zoroastrianism was a very influential faith, though. Many scholars think that ideas of cosmic dualism, good and evil, God versus Satan, that are found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam originated with Zoroastrianism, which is a religion that really focuses on this cosmic dualism, the struggle between good and evil. And the sacred text the main sacred text of Zoroastrianism is the Avesta. It is also very old. We don't know when it was first written down, but it's often thought to go back to, again, the second millennium BCE. The two terms are cognates, soma and hauma. The early Indic peoples, or the early Indo-European peoples who moved into India in the Vedic period were related to the Iranian peoples who wrote the Avesta, the same sort of larger branch of the Indo-European language family. So these two terms come from the same common root word. In the Rig Veda, soma is talked about repeatedly, and it's talked about both as a plant and as a god. So to quote one line from it, we have drunk the soma, we have become immortal, we have gone to the light, we have found the gods. What can hostility do to us now? And what the malice of a mortal, O immortal one? So you got this kind of a dual depiction. In the Avesta, Hauma is described as furthering healing, sexual arousal, physically strengthening, stimulating alertness and awareness, mildly intoxicating without negative side effects, and nourishing, nutritious for the soul. Nothing here, though, about becoming one with the divine, which we get in some of the Vedic soma lines. So there's some different ways these can be interpreted. So scholars for decades have been curious about this. I mean, anyone who has knowledge of these ancient religious practices and texts knows about the importance of this substance. So what was it? Right now, the leading contender is ephedra. Amanita muscaria, psychedelic mushroom, we'll talk about that later. Cannabis, Syrian rue, I may talk about that in the last lecture. It does have pretty strong psychoactive effects. Sacred lotus of ancient Egypt, I'll talk about that briefly. The hallucinogen psilocybin, ergot, another hallucinogen, or even opium. Some scholars think it was a mixture, maybe cannabis, ephedra, and opium all together, and there have been archaeological excavations that find braziers in Central Asia with such mixtures in them. In the Rig Veda, one thing that's very clear is that soma was a substance of war. The god Indra, after consuming Soma was able to defeat the drought demon. So very, very militant imagery we can see here in a much later depiction, but we got the original text here. I'm not going to read it out to you. So these sort of depictions made many scholars think that Soma could not have been a psychedelic substance, something like Amanita muscaria or psilocybin. Psychedelics are not associated in general. There are exceptions, but are not generally associated with war. Much more effective for battle is a powerful stimulant, like something like ephedra. It's going to allow you to defeat your enemies. So in this Cambridge University online press from 2009, a bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, where it was originally published, the argument is that, and I'll read here from the quote, in both the Rig Veda and the Avesta, sorry, that's misspelled, Soma, Homa are said to enhance alertness and awareness, and did not coincide with the consciousness-altering effect of an entheogen, in other words, a psychedelic, and that there is nothing shamanistic or visionary in either the early Vedic or old Iranian texts. So perhaps this mystery has been solved in a somewhat prosaic manner. I think a lot of scholars were hoping that it was something more psychedelic, but it seems to be ephedra. And there have been plenty of archaeological excavations. It's interesting. The abstract here calls ephedra a mysterious hallucinogenic medicinal plant. Well, yeah, it's only hallucinogenic if taken in very, very large doses. And it does have medicinal effects. But anyway, unearthed from very Bronze Age cemeteries in Central Asia. And ephedra may have been one of the earliest plants potentially used for corpse embalming. That's interesting. I don't know what the evidence is there, or religious worship. And there's quite a bit of evidence for that. So just to offer some concluding remarks here, start with Khat. It is the most potent plant-based stimulant, hence it's the most problematic. Coffee, tea, even tobacco, these are not social problems. Tobacco certainly has medical problems, but I don't think there's ever been concern about people smoking too much tobacco and becoming unruly or violent or anything like that. With Khat, well, most people who chew it do so convivially, just in large sessions, but they some certainly do cross over the line into problematic or violent behavior. I've just recalled a slide that I think I had at one time, but seems to have disappeared from the deck. But I would like to bring it up, which was a very interesting article called Castles Built of Spit. And this is a term that is used in Yemen a lot by women who are upset with Yemeni men spending so much time chewing khat. And by castles built of spit, what they mean are elaborate plans that men will come up with while chewing khat. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to accomplish all these things. It gives you a sense of power and ability and competence. But then, what about the carrying it through? A little bit more difficult, and especially if you're just chewing khat in these sessions of sociability, it does make it difficult to go out and start accomplishing these things. More important, though, the effects wear off, and then you have the down, and what comes of it? Yes, it's just a castle built of spit. Big questions of whether Yemen or Somalia as well suffer from a national addiction syndrome, and I should say for men, because there's relatively little khat chewing by women in either country, and there is a lot of gender tension. And we've noticed gender issues in a lot of the psychoactive substances we've covered. It's quite marked here in the case of khat. Then with Captagon, I think it's really important because it illustrates the potential dangers of the creation of new synthetic drugs. So new synthetic drugs are being made all the time. Often it's just a question of tweaking the chemistry of existing ones. But you do that, you get different effects, in some cases, different benefits, but in many cases, different problems. And Captagon may be a rather extreme case if at least if some of these allegations about its association with violent activity, imperviousness to pain, and so on are true. And then with this Soma Hauma issue, I think this is really important because it illustrates sort of the deep historical importance of psychoactive substances. And it's also a case in which there has been a lot of research, a lot of very interesting debates about these substances, based both on the textual evidence, but also now increasingly on archaeological evidence, where scholars are able to find residue of things like ephedra or cannabis or opium in ancient implements, braziers especially. And so we'll talk about that when we talk about opium and when we talk about cannabis. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune in for the next episode, which will look at a drug that's very hard to classify, which is kava or kava, which is the main traditional drug of the Pacific, and one that is also spreading these days. So I hope you stay tuned.